My parents spent $250,000 to manufacture a perfect doctor out of my brother, while telling me that girls do not need college and should just focus on finding a wealthy husband. I paid my own way through medical school, worked 5 different jobs to survive, and became a chief of surgery without a single dime or word of support from them. Years later, I sat quietly in the back corner of my brother's lavish engagement party as my father proudly declared him their only successful child to a room full of wealthy guests. But the smug grins on my family's faces vanished the second the brilliant and beautiful bride took the microphone, locked eyes with me across the ballroom, and turned completely pale. She ignored her groom, marched straight past my beaming parents, and asked the one question that would destroy my brother's entire fabricated life. I am Claire, 35 years old, and sitting at that corner table was the defining moment of my life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth and tried to steal your light. Growing up in a wealthy suburb of Chicago meant that the expectations in our house were strictly divided by gender. My parents, Richard and Susan, treated my older brother Bradley like absolute royalty, while treating me like a temporary house guest they were eager to marry off. Our sprawling estate was a fortress of traditional and toxic expectations. Bradley was given brand new cars, private tutors, and endless praise for doing the bare minimum. I was given chores, criticism, and constant reminders that my ambition was considered unattractive. Tonight was absolutely no different. The Crystal Room at the Oak Brook Country Club had been completely transformed for Bradley's engagement party. Thousands of imported white orchids cascaded from the ceiling, and a live string quartet played softly in the corner. I was invited out of sheer obligation, seated at table number 14, which was wedged right between the swinging kitchen doors and a massive decorative ice sculpture that was slowly melting onto my shoes. I sat alone, watching my mother Susan glide across the room in a designer gown. She was busy introducing Bradley to Naomi's highly educated and incredibly wealthy relatives. Naomi was stunning. She was a brilliant African-American corporate attorney with a razor-sharp mind and a family pedigree full of federal judges and diplomats. I could easily see why Bradley wanted her. I could also clearly see why my parents were desperately trying to impress her family. They had spared absolutely no expense tonight, making sure everyone in the room knew that the groom was a prominent and highly successful physician. They wanted to secure this marriage to elevate their own social status. I sipped my sparkling water and traced the rim of my glass, feeling the familiar and exhausting weight of my family's delusion. My hands were rough from years of scrubbing into surgery, a stark contrast to Bradley's perfectly manicured fingers that had never performed a single medical procedure in his life. The string quartet suddenly stopped playing. The gentle clinking of a silver spoon against crystal echoed through the massive ballroom. My father Richard stood at the head table, his face flushed with expensive wine and unearned pride. He adjusted his silk tie and smiled warmly at the crowd of distinguished guests. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate the union of two remarkable families," he began, his voice booming proudly through the microphone. "When I look at Bradley and Naomi, I see two brilliant minds, two equals. But let me tell you, getting this boy to the finish line was no small feat." The crowd chuckled appreciatively. Richard placed a heavy and affectionate hand on Bradley's shoulder. Bradley puffed out his chest, looking every bit the confident and established surgeon he claimed to be. My father leaned into the microphone, his eyes sweeping across the wealthy guests. Susan and I always knew Bradley was destined for absolute greatness. That is why we did not hesitate to invest $250,000 to put him through the finest medical programs. We knew the world needed his healing hands. He is the absolute pride of our family and our only successful child. I did not flinch. I just took another slow sip of my water. But my father was not finished. He needed a punchline. He needed to elevate his golden boy by stepping on his favorite stepping stone. Richard's eyes scanned the room until they finally found me half hidden in the shadows of table 14. He pointed his champagne flute directly at me, a condescending smirk spreading across his face. And then there is my daughter Claire. We told Claire years ago that girls do not need college. We told her to just go find a good husband. We are still waiting on that kiddo. Maybe you can catch the bouquet tonight. A wave of awkward and uncomfortable laughter rippled through the ballroom. Several guests turned in their chairs to stare at me, their eyes filled with second-hand embarrassment and pity. Susan giggled into her napkin at the head table. Bradley shook his head, looking at me with absolute disdain, as if my mere presence at the back of the room was an insult to his prestige. They expected me to shrink. They expected me to blush, look down at my lap, and absorb the humiliation exactly the way I did when I was a vulnerable teenager living under their roof. Instead, I sat perfectly still. I kept my posture straight, my expression completely unreadable, and held my father's gaze until he nervously cleared his throat and looked away. Let us raise a glass to the future, Dr. and Mrs. Bradley. Richard quickly finished raising his flute high into the air. The room erupted in applause. Bradley leaned in to kiss Naomi, but she was not looking at him. Naomi gracefully stood up, her stunning silk gown rustling as she took the microphone from my father. She smiled politely at the crowd, thanking them for their presence. I want to thank Richard and Susan for hosting such a magnificent evening, Naomi said, her voice smooth and confident. And I want to thank Bradley for telling me so much about his incredible medical career. She turned to face the room, but as her eyes swept over the tables, they suddenly stopped. The polite smile completely vanished from her face. She froze mid-sentence. The microphone picked up a sharp and trembling intake of breath. Naomi was staring directly past the centerpieces, past the wealthy guests, straight into the dark corner of table 14. She locked eyes with me. The silence in the room became heavy and thick with sudden tension. Naomi slowly lowered the microphone. It hit the wooden podium with a loud and jarring thud that echoed through the entire ballroom. She did not look at her groom. She did not look at her future in-laws. Naomi stepped off the main stage, lifted the skirt of her gown, and marched straight through the crowd. She parted the sea of confused guests until she stood right in front of my table. Her voice trembled, stripped of all its previous corporate polish, as she looked down at me and asked, "Doctor, do you remember me?" I looked up at the beautiful bride standing before me. I recognized the scar on her collarbone immediately. It was a faint silver line barely visible above the sweetheart neckline of her dress. I nodded slowly and set my water glass down on the white tablecloth. Of course I remember you, Naomi. You were a highly complex thoracic reconstruction. November 14th, 3 years ago, at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Naomi let out a choked breath. She pressed her hand against her chest right over the scar. Her eyes filled with a mixture of profound gratitude and absolute terror. You are Dr. Claire. You were the lead surgeon on the trauma ward that night. You are the one who spent 9 hours in the operating room putting my ribs and lungs back together after that semi-truck crossed the center median. I smiled a tight professional smile. I am glad to see you breathing so well on your own. You were a fighter. The wealthy guests sitting at the tables around us were dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpeted floor. My parents had finally realized what was happening. They rushed down from the head table and were frantically pushing through the crowd with Bradley trailing nervously right behind them. Susan reached us first. Her face was twisted in a panicked scowl beneath her heavy makeup. She reached out to grab Naomi by the arm to pull her away from my table. Naomi? Darling, what on earth are you doing talking to her? Susan said with a forced, nervous laugh. Come back to the stage right now. She is just a medical assistant. She probably just emptied your bedpans and thinks she is important. She is just trying to ruin your special night because she is jealous. Naomi snatched her arm away from my mother so fast that Susan actually stumbled backward into a waiter. Naomi did not even look at Susan. Her eyes were completely locked on me. Her brilliant legal mind was rapidly putting the pieces together right there in the middle of the ballroom. She was a corporate attorney who specialized in fraud, and I could see the exact moment the devastating truth clicked into place in her brain. Naomi swallowed hard. She turned her head slowly and looked at Bradley, who was now standing right behind my parents. He was sweating profusely right through his expensive custom tuxedo. His face had gone completely gray, and his eyes were darting toward the exit like a trapped rat. Bradley, Naomi said, her voice dropping into a dangerously low register. You told me you were the surgical consultant who oversaw my chest reconstruction. You told my father you were the one who directed the trauma team that night. You said you were the one who held my heart in your hands. Bradley stammered and took a step back. He tried to laugh, but it sounded like a dying animal gasping for air. Babe, you are confused. You had a massive amount of pain medication back then. You were barely conscious for weeks. You do not remember things clearly. This is just my jealous sister trying to cause a scene because she is bitter. She is still single. Please let us just go cut the cake and ignore her. I stood up from my chair. I smoothed down the front of my dress and stepped directly into Bradley's line of sight. He took another physical step backward, trying to hide behind our father. I am afraid the hospital's surgical records are quite clear, Bradley, I said, my voice projecting perfectly across the silent room. I was the attending trauma surgeon on shift that night. I do not recall you stepping foot in my operating room. In fact, I do not recall you ever stepping foot inside Northwestern Memorial as a physician at all. Naomi took a threatening step toward Bradley. The elegant grace of a blushing bride was completely gone. It was replaced entirely by the ruthless corporate litigator who destroyed grown men on the witness stand for a living. You showed my family your medical journals, Bradley, Naomi demanded, stepping closer to him until he bumped into a table. You showed my father the published papers on thoracic trauma reconstruction to prove you were a top-tier surgeon. You used those journals to convince my family to invest in your career. Those were my publications, I said, calmly folding my arms across my chest. Volume 42 of the American Journal of Surgery. If you check the author index, you will find my exact name and credentials. He simply used our shared last name when he showed them to you and let you assume they were his work. He stole my professional identity to impress you. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Naomi's father, the prominent federal judge, stood up from his table at the very front of the room. His imposing figure cast a long shadow as he began to walk toward us with a furious expression on his face. Naomi looked at the man she was supposed to marry in exactly 6 weeks. She looked at the man my parents had just praised as a $250,000 success story on a microphone. I watched my golden child brother absolutely crumble under the weight of his own lies. For 35 years, I had been told I was the lesser child. I had scrubbed hospital floors on the night shift and waitered double shifts just to pay for my undergraduate degree, while they handed him $250,000. He had spent his entire life taking what was not his. But he made a fatal mistake when he tried to take credit for the very hands that saved his future wife. My father, Richard, finally stepped forward, trying to shield Bradley from Naomi's intense, glaring eyes. Now listen here, Naomi, Richard said, using his deep, authoritative voice that he usually used to bully his employees. There is a simple misunderstanding here. Claire is clearly intoxicated and making things up to steal her brother's spotlight. Bradley is a very respected doctor. We paid for his schooling ourselves. We have the bank statements to prove we sent him to medical school. You sent him to a medical school in the Caribbean, I corrected my father without raising my voice. And he failed out in his 2nd year. He never passed his medical boards. He never completed a residency. He is not a doctor. He is a fraud who has been living off your money and lying to this poor woman. Richard turned purple with rage. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my face. Shut your mouth, you ungrateful brat, Richard hissed quietly so the rest of the room would not hear. You are ruining your brother's life. I am not ruining anything, I replied softly, my eyes locked onto his. I am just providing a second opinion. Naomi ignored my father completely. She reached up and grabbed the lapels of Bradley's tuxedo jacket. Her voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers overhead, carrying a terrifying, absolute authority. "Why did you lie to me, Bradley?" she demanded, her voice cracking with fury. "Why did you tell my entire family you were a surgeon?" Bradley peeled Naomi's hands off his tuxedo jacket. The panicked sweat was now dripping down his forehead and soaking into his stiff white collar. He looked frantically around the ballroom. The whispers of 200 wealthy guests had grown into a loud and chaotic hum. People were standing up at their tables, craning their necks to see the spectacle. The string quartet had completely abandoned their instruments. The clinking of crystal and silver had stopped entirely. Bradley grabbed Naomi by the elbow and tried to physically drag her away from my table. "We are leaving." Bradley ordered, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fake authority. "You are having some kind of stress-induced breakdown, Naomi. I am not going to stand here and let my delusional sister infect your mind. She is a medical assistant. She cleans bedpans and stocks supply closets. She has been obsessed with my success since we were kids, and now she is making up insane lies to ruin the happiest day of my life." Naomi dug her heels into the thick carpet and violently yanked her arm out of his grasp. "Do not ever put your hands on me," she warned, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "And do not ever tell me I am having a breakdown. I asked you a direct question, Bradley. Are you or are you not a board-certified surgeon?" Bradley opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at our mother Susan for help. Susan was wringing her hands together, her expensive diamond rings flashing under the chandelier lights. She stepped forward, trying to block Naomi's view of me. She pasted on a frantic, artificial smile that did not reach her panicked eyes. "Naomi, sweetie, please," Susan pleaded, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Claire has always been deeply troubled. She has these delusions of grandeur. She applied to medical school years ago and got rejected, and she never recovered from the jealousy. Bradley is trying to protect her privacy, but she is deeply unwell. We just need to get you two out of here so she can calm down and we can continue this beautiful evening." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. When you spend 12 hours a day commanding an operating room full of people holding scalpels and clamps, you learn exactly how to throw your voice so that every single person in the room hears you clearly. I stepped around my mother, completely ignoring her desperate attempt to paint me as insane. "My name is Dr. Claire," I stated with icy precision, cutting right through my mother's frantic lies. "I am the chief of general surgery at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. I completed my undergraduate degree at Johns Hopkins University, graduating summa cum laude while working 3 jobs to pay my own tuition. I completed my medical degree at the University of Chicago, followed by a 5-year surgical residency and a 2-year trauma fellowship. My state medical license number is registered and active, and my national provider identifier is completely public record. Anyone in this room with a smartphone can verify my credentials in exactly 30 seconds. I took a step closer to Bradley, who was now backing up until he hit the edge of the table. The ice sculpture next to us was dripping a steady stream of water onto the floor, matching the cold sweat pouring down his face. His expensive, tailored tuxedo suddenly looked like a costume he had stolen from a theater department. And as for those medical journals, I continued, my voice steady and relentless. "You brought volume 42 of the American Journal of Surgery to Naomi's father to prove your expertise. You showed him the peer-reviewed article on complex thoracic wall reconstruction. You pointed to the author listed simply as Dr. C last name, and you let him assume the C stood for your middle name, Charles. You did not just lie about your job, Bradley. You took physical copies of my life's work. You took the research and the late nights I spent bleeding over case studies while you were busy failing out of a Caribbean medical school, and you passed them off as your own to buy your way into a family that is vastly out of your league." The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming through the ceiling vents. Naomi let out a breath that sounded like a dry sob. She looked at Bradley with a mixture of absolute disgust and profound betrayal. You told my father you were publishing a second paper next month, she said, her voice shaking with rage. You asked him to introduce you to the board of directors at his private equity firm so you could secure funding for a new surgical center. You were going to take their money. Bradley's face went from pale gray to a mottled, angry red. The charming, successful doctor facade completely evaporated, leaving behind the spoiled, vicious little boy I had known my entire life. He lunged forward, closing the distance between us in a split second. He backed me right up against the heavy wooden table, trapping me between his broad shoulders and the melting ice sculpture. He used his physical size to try and intimidate me, the same way he used to when we were teenagers. You think you are so smart? He hissed, his face inches from mine. His breath smelled heavily of expensive bourbon and sheer panic. You think you can just waltz in here and destroy everything I have built? You are nothing, Claire. You are a miserable, lonely spinster, and nobody in this family even wanted you here. I am going to ruin you for this. I did not flinch. I did not back away. I looked directly into his bloodshot eyes and smiled a cold, hollow smile. You cannot destroy something that was completely, entirely fake to begin with, Bradley, I whispered back. Before Bradley could say another word, a heavy hand slammed onto his shoulder. Naomi's father, the federal judge, had crossed the ballroom and was now standing directly behind my brother. The judge was a tall, imposing man who commanded respect the second he walked into a room. Step away from her, the judge ordered, his voice echoing with absolute authority. Bradley froze, but he did not move away from me. Instead, my mother Susan stepped right between us. She did not step in to push Bradley away or to protect me from his physical aggression. She stepped in to stand shoulder to shoulder with him, forming a physical wall between her golden boy and the daughter she despised. Susan turned her head and glared at me. It was a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. Her eyes were dark and completely devoid of any maternal warmth. It was the exact same look she had given me on the day I packed my bags for college without a single dollar of their help. That hateful glare lasted only a fraction of a second before Susan completely transformed her demeanor. She spun around to face Naomi and instantly replaced her vicious scowl with a mask of exaggerated maternal sorrow. She placed both of her hands over her heart and let out a dramatic, trembling sigh, playing the role of the victimized mother with terrifying ease. I am so incredibly sorry you have to witness this ugly display, Naomi, my mother said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. Claire was not even invited to this dinner tonight. She crashed this private party specifically to ruin this beautiful moment for you and Bradley because she is eaten alive by bitter jealousy. She is 35 years old and completely alone. She is a tragic spinster who cannot stand to see her younger brother find true love and achieve the massive success she always dreamed of, but never had the intellect to reach. I did not interrupt her. When you are dealing with pathological liars, the best strategy is often to hand them the shovel and let them dig their own grave. I stood with my hands resting easily at my sides, watching my mother weave an elaborate tapestry of absolute fiction right in front of 200 people. Naomi did not say a word either. She just stared at Susan with the cold, analytical eyes of a corporate litigator watching a hostile witness perjure themselves on the stand. Emboldened by our silence, Susan took a step closer to Naomi and lowered her voice as if she were sharing a heartbreaking family secret. Claire has been deeply mentally unstable for years. Susan continued, shaking her head sadly while looking at the crowd to garner their pity. She intercepts Bradley's mail. She memorizes his medical journals and steals his professional correspondence just to feel important. She even bought a fake hospital badge online. She has built this entire pathetic fantasy world in her head, where she is the successful doctor and Bradley is the failure. It is a textbook psychological complex. We have tried to get her psychiatric help for so many years, but she refuses to take her medication. Please, Naomi, you have to understand that nothing she says is grounded in reality. She is a very sick woman who is just desperately crying out for attention. I actually had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud. My mother was standing in front of a prominent federal judge and a brilliant corporate attorney trying to convince them that a chief of surgery was actually an unmedicated stalker who intercepted hospital mail. It was a spectacular display of narcissistic desperation. Richard sensed that Susan's emotional performance needed an authoritative closer. He puffed out his chest and stepped forward, pointing a thick, threatening finger right at my face. "I have had enough of this circus," Richard announced, his voice booming through the silent ballroom. "You are trespassing, Claire. I am calling the country club security right now to have you physically removed from the premises. You are an absolute disgrace to this family. We gave you everything, and this is how you repay us. You will not ruin my son's engagement party with your psychotic delusions." My father turned and snapped his fingers at a terrified-looking waiter who was standing near the swinging kitchen doors. "Go get the manager right now," Richard ordered loudly. "Tell them we have an uninvited guest who is harassing the bride and needs to be escorted off the property immediately. Call the local police if you have to. I want her out of my sight before she does any more damage." The young waiter took a nervous step backward, unsure of what to do. But before he could run off to find the security team, a deep, resonant voice cut through the chaos like a crack of thunder. "Nobody is calling security, and nobody is leaving this room until we settle this right here and right now." The wealthy crowd parted immediately as Naomi's father stepped forward from the front row of tables. Judge Davis was a towering African-American man with distinguished silver hair and a lifetime appointment to the federal bench. He was a man who spent every single day of his life sniffing out lies and dismantling frauds in a federal courtroom. He did not look angry. He looked entirely terrifying in his absolute rigid calm. He walked over and stood right beside his daughter, folding his arms across the chest of his impeccably tailored suit. Judge Davis looked at my mother, Susan, with a gaze so piercing it made her physically take a step backward. "My daughter does not suffer from hallucinations," the judge stated, his voice low and incredibly dangerous. "She has a photographic memory, which is exactly why she is the youngest senior partner at her prestigious law firm. And she certainly knows the face of the woman who cracked her chest open to reconstruct her rib cage and save her life." Susan opened her mouth to argue, but the judge raised a single finger, silencing her instantly. He shifted his heavy gaze from my mother to Bradley. Bradley looked like he was about to pass out on the carpet. He was swaying slightly on his feet, his mouth opening and closing like a fish suffocating on dry land. All of the unearned arrogance that my parents had inflated him with over the past 3 decades was completely gone. The judge uncrossed his arms and pointed directly at my brother's chest. "I do not care about your ridiculous family drama, and I certainly do not care about your pathetic attempts to diagnose your sister with a psychological condition just to save face." Judge Davis said, his tone echoing with absolute authority. "I only care about the law and the facts. If you are the esteemed surgeon you claim to be Bradley, then this should be a very simple misunderstanding to resolve." The judge took one final intimidating step toward my brother, closing the distance between them. "I do not want to hear another word from your parents making excuses for you," the judge demanded. "I want you to look me in the eye right now and tell me exactly whose name is on that state medical license." Bradley stared at the towering federal judge with absolute terror in his eyes. He opened his mouth to answer, but his throat seized up entirely. He looked like a cornered animal desperately searching for an escape route that did not exist. Instead of answering the judge, my brother looked at our mother. It was a pathetic, unspoken plea for her to clean up his massive, catastrophic mess, just like she had done his entire life. Susan tried to step forward again, putting on a shaky, aristocratic smile. "Your Honor, please." Susan began, her voice trembling as she realized the gravity of the situation. "This is a private family matter. We are simply trying to handle a sensitive medical issue with my daughter behind closed doors. You must understand that we cannot take anything she says as the truth." I did not let her finish that sentence. I stepped right past my mother and stood directly in front of Judge Davis and Naomi. "Let me help him out since my brother seems to have lost his voice," I said, clearly my words ringing out through the dead silent ballroom. The name printed on that state medical license is mine. And my mother is absolutely right about one thing. We should talk about the truth right here in front of everyone. Susan turned sharply toward me, her eyes wide with panic. Claire, shut your mouth right now, she hissed under her breath. No, I do not think I will, I replied, turning to face my parents fully. You want to stand here in front of 200 people and diagnose me with a psychological condition to protect his fragile ego. You want to talk about reality, Mother. Let us talk about reality. Let us talk about the $250,000 you and Dad wired to a for-profit island medical school in the Caribbean because your precious golden boy could not pass a basic biology entrance exam in the United States. The wealthy guests in the room gasped collectively. The polished, sophisticated image my parents had spent the entire evening curating began to shatter into a million pieces. Richard lunged forward to stop me, but Judge Davis held up a massive hand, physically blocking my father from getting any closer. Let her speak, the judge commanded, his voice echoing like thunder. I looked right at Bradley, who was now staring at his shoes, completely humiliated. You told me my entire childhood that girls do not need college, I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. You told me I was not worth the investment. When I got accepted into Johns Hopkins University, you refused to co-sign a single student loan. You told me to go find a husband to pay my bills, while you bought Bradley a brand new luxury sedan to celebrate his acceptance to a school that takes anyone with a cleared check. Susan opened her mouth to deny it, but the truth was pouring out of me like a flood breaking through a dam, and I was not going to stop until the entire structure of their lies was washed away. I worked 5 different jobs to survive. I continued stepping closer to my parents so they were forced to look me in the eye. I scrubbed biohazard waste and bodily fluids off hospital floors on the night shift just to pay for my textbooks. I worked back-to-back double shifts waitressing at a diner until the soles of my feet blistered and bled. I spent my weekends tutoring underclassmen for $20 an hour. I paid for my own tuition, my own rent, and my own food. I clawed my way through a grueling pre-med program while you were busy funding his endless island vacations. Naomi watched me with wide eyes. Her brilliant legal mind was absorbing every single detail, every timeline, and every financial discrepancy I was laying out. The disgust on her face was no longer just directed at Bradley. She was looking at my parents with absolute profound revulsion. And then came my graduation day, I said, my voice dropping into a cold, hard whisper that somehow carried further than a shout. I graduated at the very top of my surgical class. I received my medical degree with top honors. And where were the 2 of you? My parents stared at me in horrified silence. They knew exactly where they had been. You were in Florida, I answered for them. You missed your only daughter's medical school graduation because you were busy flying down to Miami to pay the security deposit on Bradley's luxury beachfront condo. You told me he needed a comfortable, quiet place to study for the medical boards. The same medical boards that he failed 3 consecutive times before the school eventually expelled him for academic dishonesty. You shut up, Richard roared suddenly, losing the last shred of his carefully maintained country club composure. I did not stop. He spent your $250,000 living like a wealthy bachelor, I stated. Pointing directly at the custom tuxedo Bradley was sweating through. He used your money and my medical publications to trick this beautiful, brilliant woman into thinking he was on her level. He is not a doctor. He has never been a doctor. He is a parasite. Richard was completely backed into a corner by the inescapable public truth. The embarrassment of being exposed in front of the exact high society crowd he was trying to impress completely shattered his mind. He turned purple with blind, raging fury. He stormed over to table 14 and violently slammed his heavy fist down onto the white tablecloth. The impact shook the entire table, causing the massive ice sculpture to rattle dangerously and several crystal glasses to topple over, shattering onto the floor. You owe your entire existence to us! Richard screamed at the top of his lungs, spit flying from his lips. We put a roof over your head. We fed you. We raised you. You are an ungrateful, vicious little snake. You will stop lying to your brother's fiancé immediately, or I will destroy you." Naomi did not flinch at my father's screaming. Instead, she looked at him with the absolute disgust of a woman who dismantled hostile takeovers and white-collar criminals for a living. She recognized a desperate bluff when she saw one. She turned her back on my father, completely dismissing his tantrum, and focused entirely on the man she had almost married, Bradley. Naomi said her voice was no longer trembling. It was as cold and sharp as a scalpel. "You have stood here for 10 minutes and let your parents attack your sister. You let your mother invent a psychotic delusion, and you let your father scream at a woman who just exposed massive financial discrepancies. But you have not actually defended yourself with a single piece of evidence. So we are going to make this very simple." Bradley swallowed hard. His eyes darted nervously around the room. The wealthy guests who were still seated were completely silent, watching the spectacle unfold. Some were even pulling out their phones to text the gossip to people who were not there. The social ruin my parents feared most was happening in real time. "Show me your medical license," Naomi demanded, holding out her hand. "Show me your physical hospital identification badge. Show me anything right now, in this exact second, that proves you are a board-certified surgeon. If you pull out a valid medical license, I will apologize to your family and we will continue this party. If you cannot produce it, the wedding is permanently off." Bradley patted the pockets of his expensive custom tuxedo jacket. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely coordinate the movement. "Babe," he stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "I do not carry my medical license in my formal wear. My wallet is out in the valet parking lot in the glove compartment of my car. You cannot seriously expect me to have my credentials on me at our engagement party. This is insane, Naomi. You are letting my crazy sister ruin our lives." Naomi slowly lowered her hand. The last shred of hope in her eyes completely died. She looked at Bradley not with anger, but with profound pity. "You drove here with me, Bradley," she said softly. "We took my car. Your car is parked at our apartment downtown. You do not even have the decency to come up with a clever lie." Bradley reached out to grab her hands, but she stepped back as if he were carrying a contagious disease. "Do not touch me," Naomi warned. She reached down to her left hand. She slid the massive 3-carat diamond engagement ring off her finger. The ring that my parents had undoubtedly paid for, with the money they claimed was going toward his medical clinic. Naomi did not throw the ring at him. She did not scream or cry. She walked over to table 14 and gently set the diamond ring down on the white tablecloth, right next to my glass of sparkling water. "You can give this to your parents," Naomi told him, "since they are the ones funding your entire fabricated existence. I will have my assistant send a truck to collect my belongings from the apartment tomorrow morning. Do not be there when they arrive." Naomi turned to her father. Judge Davis nodded once, a silent confirmation between a father and daughter who had just narrowly avoided a catastrophic mistake. "Let us go," the judge announced to his family. "We have heard more than enough." The entire ballroom watched in stunned silence as Naomi, her father, and her entire side of the family stood up from their tables. Dozens of highly educated, wealthy, and influential people gathered their coats and began walking toward the exit. The mass exodus was deafening in its quiet dignity. They did not shout insults or make a scene. They simply walked out, abandoning the $250,000 golden boy in the middle of his ruined kingdom. My mother Susan let out a loud, dramatic wail and collapsed into a nearby chair, sobbing into her hands. This time, the tears were actually real, because she was watching her social climbing dreams evaporate into thin air. Bradley stood frozen, staring at the diamond ring resting on my table. His chest was heaving, but he was too much of a coward to chase after the woman he had just lost. But my father was not finished. Richard watched his chance at high society connections walk out the door, and his fury boiled over into physical violence. He lunged across the space between us and violently grabbed my upper arm. His fingers dug deeply into my skin, bruising the muscle. His face was a dark, terrifying purple. "You are going to fix this," Richard hissed, his breath hot and rancid against my face. "You are going to march out to that parking lot right now and tell Naomi you made it all up. You are going to tell her you are off your medication. You will beg for her forgiveness, or I swear to God, Claire, you are completely dead to this family. You will have nothing." I looked down at the heavy hand gripping my arm. Years ago, that grip would have terrified me into submission. Years ago, I would have cried and apologized just to keep the peace and avoid his legendary temper. But I was no longer the frightened little girl living in his house. I was a trauma surgeon who spent every single day making life or death decisions under immense pressure. I grabbed his wrist with my free hand. I applied exactly the right amount of pressure to his radial nerve. It was a simple anatomical trick, but it sent a sharp shooting pain straight up his arm. Richard gasped in shock, and his fingers instantly released my arm. "I am already dead to this family, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any affection. "I died to you the day you decided my only value was finding a husband while you poured all of your resources into a fraud. I do not want your money, and I certainly do not want your name." I picked up my small clutch purse from the table. I left the diamond ring sitting exactly where Naomi had placed it. I turned my back on my weeping mother, my pathetic brother, and my enraged father. I walked out of the Oak Brook Country Club with my head held high, leaving them entirely alone in a ballroom full of melted ice and broken lies. As I walked through the grand lobby of the country club, I could hear the whispers of the remaining guests spreading like wildfire. My parents had invited their business partners, their country club friends, and their neighbors to witness their ultimate triumph. Instead, they had just broadcast their absolute failure to the entire wealthy suburb. I handed my ticket to the valet and waited for my car in the cool night air. My phone buzzed in my purse. It was a text from an unknown number, but I knew exactly who it was. The message simply read, "Thank you." It was from Naomi. The engagement was over, but the war with my family was just beginning. They would never let this go. They would blame me for the money they had lost, and the reputation that was currently burning to the ground inside that ballroom. I took a deep breath of the crisp evening air and smiled. I was ready for whatever they tried next. The morning sun was just beginning to rise over the Chicago skyline when my peaceful sanctuary was violently breached. It was exactly 7 in the morning. I was standing in the kitchen of my Gold Coast penthouse, wearing a silk robe and waiting for my espresso machine to finish brewing. I had spent the last 10 years building a life of absolute peace and quiet. My apartment spanned the entire top floor of the building, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered an unobstructed view of Lake Michigan. It was a multi-million-dollar fortress that I bought with my own hard-earned money from years of grueling surgical shifts. I assumed the heavy security downstairs would keep my toxic family at bay. I was incredibly wrong. The private elevator that opened directly into my foyer suddenly chimed. I set my coffee cup down on the white marble kitchen island just as the polished steel doors slid open. My father Richard and my mother Susan stepped out into my home. They looked completely disheveled. Their country club elegance from the night before had been replaced by wrinkled clothes and dark circles under their eyes. They had clearly been up all night doing damage control for their golden boy. I learned later that my mother had put on a hysterical performance in the lobby downstairs. She had sobbed to the doorman, claiming that there was a severe family medical emergency and that I was not answering my phone. She played the role of the frantic, terrified mother so perfectly that the young security guard panicked and used his master keycard to send the elevator up to my private floor without calling up to my intercom first. But the moment the elevator doors opened and they stepped into my foyer, the frantic act completely evaporated. They stopped dead in their tracks. Both of my parents stood frozen on my imported hardwood floors, their mouths slightly open as they took in the sheer scale of my wealth. They had spent the last decade assuming I was struggling to pay rent in some cramped studio apartment. They truly believed their own twisted narrative that I was a bitter, underachieving spinster who worked a low-level medical job. The reality of my massive success hit them like a physical blow. Their eyes darted nervously around the massive open-concept living space. They took in the expensive modern art hanging on the walls, the custom velvet furniture, and the massive crystal chandelier suspended over the 12-seat dining table. My father swallowed hard, his face flushing an angry red as he realized my kitchen alone was worth more than his entire retirement portfolio. The cognitive dissonance was physically breaking their minds. They could not reconcile the daughter they had treated like absolute garbage with the highly successful, powerful surgeon standing in front of them in a luxury penthouse. But narcissistic parents never admit defeat. When faced with undeniable proof that they are wrong, they simply attack from a different angle to regain their perceived superiority. Susan recovered first. She gripped her designer handbag tightly and narrowed her eyes at me. She stepped off the elevator and began walking through my living room, her high heels clicking sharply against the wood. "This place is incredibly cold, Claire," my mother said, her voice dripping with venom. "It feels completely sterile, like a hospital waiting room. I suppose it makes sense since you clearly do not have a family or a husband to make it feel like a real home. It is just a big empty glass box for a very lonely, miserable woman." I leaned against the marble island and crossed my arms over my chest. "I did not invite you into my glass box, Mother," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "You are trespassing in my home at 7 in the morning. You bypassed my building security by lying to a young man doing his job. You have exactly 2 minutes to say whatever it is you came here to say before I call the concierge and have you both escorted out into the street by the police." Richard stormed past my mother, his face contorted into the same familiar mask of rage he wore the night before. He slammed his heavy hands down on the back of one of my custom dining chairs, gripping the fabric so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You have a lot of nerve threatening us after what you did," Richard shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You completely destroyed your brother's life last night out of pure malicious spite. Bradley is sitting in our living room right now, absolutely inconsolable. He is weeping like a child because of you. Naomi has blocked all of our phone numbers, and her family is threatening to sue us for defamation. You ruined the most important day of his life." I let out a short, dry laugh. "I did not ruin anything," I corrected him, taking a slow sip of my freshly brewed espresso. "Bradley ruined his own life the second he decided to impersonate a medical professional and steal my identity to trick a woman into marrying him. All I did was turn on the lights so Naomi could see the rats running around the room. If he had just told the truth from the beginning, none of this would have happened." "He is your brother," Susan screamed, taking a threatening step toward the kitchen. "Family is supposed to protect family, Claire. You were supposed to pull him aside quietly and fix this privately. Instead, you publicly humiliated all of us in front of the most important people in our entire social circle. My friends will not even look at me this morning. The country club board is already discussing revoking our membership because of the massive scene you caused. You did this on purpose to punish us, because you are sick with jealousy over his relationship." "You are projecting, Susan," I said, using her first name to remind her she held absolutely no maternal authority over my life. "You are angry because your favorite investment completely failed. You poured $250,000 into a hollow shell of a man, and now the entire city knows it. Do not come into my home and try to blame me for your terrible parenting and your disastrous financial decisions." Richard let out a roar of frustration. He marched directly up to the marble kitchen island, stopping just inches away from where I was standing. He glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, the veins popping out on his thick neck. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He slammed it down onto the pristine white marble surface with so much force that my coffee cup rattled violently on its saucer. "You want to talk about financial decisions?" Richard hissed, his eyes burning into mine with a terrifying intensity. "You think you are so rich sitting up here in your fancy glass tower while you drag your own family through the mud? Then you are going to pay for the damage you caused." I looked down at the crumpled piece of paper resting on the marble. It was a printed invoice from the Oakbrook Country Club. It was the fully itemized bill for the ruined engagement party from last night. I could see the massive charges listed line by line. The imported floral arrangements, the live string quartet, the premium open bar, the massive catering fees, and the non-refundable deposits. The grand total printed boldly in black ink at the bottom of the page was exactly $100,000. I stared down at the crumpled invoice resting on the pristine marble surface. The bold black ink at the bottom of the page dictated a grand total of $100,000. It was an astronomical amount of money to spend on a single evening of champagne and string quartets. But my father did not look embarrassed by his financial recklessness. He looked incredibly entitled. "You are going to pay every single cent of this bill," Richard demanded, crossing his thick arms over his chest. "You caused that massive scene last night. You are the reason Naomi and her wealthy family walked out before the cake was even cut. You clearly make doctor money now anyway, since you are living in this ridiculous glass tower. $100,000 is nothing to you, but it is a massive financial blow to us." I slowly looked up from the piece of paper and met my father's furious gaze. "You want me to write a six-figure check to cover the cost of a party I was not even invited to?" I asked, my voice remaining completely flat. "A party that was entirely dedicated to celebrating a man who has been actively impersonating me. You owe your brother this much after what you did to him, my mother," Susan interrupted, stepping forward to stand next to my father. "But the money is not the only reason we are here this morning, Claire. Paying for the ruined party is just the absolute bare minimum of what you are going to do to fix this disaster." I raised an eyebrow, taking another sip of my espresso. "Please, Susan," I said, leaning back against the counter. "Tell me exactly what else you expect me to do to fix a disaster that you and your son created." Susan let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, as if she were dealing with a stubborn toddler. "Naomi has officially suspended the engagement," my mother explained, her voice tight with anxiety. "Her father, Judge Davis, is demanding to see proof of Bradley's employment and financial standing by the end of the week. He said that if we do not provide legitimate documentation showing that Bradley is a highly respected professional, the judge is going to force Naomi to cancel the wedding permanently. We cannot let that happen, Claire. Do you have any idea how important these people are? A marriage into that family would elevate our social standing permanently." "I am failing to see how my brother's pathological lies and your desperate social climbing are my responsibility," I replied. Susan took another step forward, her expensive perfume filling the space between us. "You owe him," she insisted, her voice rising in pitch. "You owe him for humiliating him in front of his peers. You owe this family for the roof we put over your head for 18 years. Naomi is a brilliant attorney, and her father is a federal judge. They are not going to just take your word for it after last night. They are going to dig. They are going to demand official employment records and financial statements. We cannot give them those because Bradley has not held a real job in 4 years. It is your responsibility to fix this because you are the chief of surgery at Northwestern Memorial Hospital." Susan snapped, her patience completely evaporating. "You have the power to hire people. So you are going to hire your brother. You are going to give him a high-paying administrative director position at your hospital starting immediately." The sheer audacity of her demand hung in the quiet air of my kitchen. I actually had to set my coffee cup down because I was genuinely stunned by the absolute delusion of what she was asking. "Let me make sure I am understanding you correctly," I said, carefully enunciating every single word. "You want me to hire a man who was expelled from a Caribbean medical school for academic fraud. You want me to bypass the Human Resources Department, the Board of Directors, and the entire hospital hiring protocol to hand my brother an executive administrative position at one of the top surgical centers in the country. He does not actually have to do any real work," Richard chimed in, waving his hand dismissively, as if the rules of a multi-billion-dollar hospital were completely beneath him. "Just give him a fancy title. Director of Hospital Operations or Vice President of Surgical Administration. Give him a large corner office with a nice view and print him an official hospital identification badge. Put him on the payroll with a respectable six-figure salary so it shows up on his tax returns. We can even funnel the money back to you if you are going to be stingy about it, Richard added, crossing his arms defensively. The point is not the money, the point is the paper trail. Naomi needs to see a legitimate pay stub from a major medical institution. She needs to walk into your hospital and see Bradley's name printed on a frosted glass door. You have the authority to make that happen with a single phone call to your administration team. My parents were standing in my home casually demanding that I commit corporate fraud. They wanted me to risk my medical license, my pristine professional reputation, and my entire career just to facilitate their son's grift. When Naomi and her father call the hospital to verify his employment, you will personally answer the phone and vouch for him. Susan instructed, her eyes gleaming with desperate determination. You will tell them that Bradley is a vital part of the hospital leadership. You will tell them that his role is incredibly important, and that you were simply confused last night because of the stress of your demanding job. If you do this, they will back off and the wedding will go forward exactly as planned. I stared at the two people who brought me into this world. For 35 years, they had diminished my achievements. They had told me I was not smart enough or valuable enough to deserve a college education. They had forced me to scrub hospital floors and wait tables until my feet bled just to afford my textbooks. And now, after I had built an absolute empire with my bare hands, they wanted to use my hospital as a cheap theatrical prop to rescue their golden boy. They did not respect my authority as a surgeon. They only saw my success as a convenient tool to fix Bradley's absolute failures. If you refuse to do this, Claire, you will be responsible for destroying our family. Richard threatened, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous growl. We took out massive loans to pay for that party last night. We made promises to Naomi's family that we cannot afford to break. You are going to give him this job, and you are going to pay this invoice, or I will make sure everyone in this city knows what an ungrateful, selfish daughter you really are. I did not yell. I did not throw them out of my apartment. I simply looked down at the massive kitchen island. I reached out and picked up the crumpled $100,000 country club invoice. I slowly smoothed out the wrinkles with the palm of my hand, flattening the heavy cardstock paper against the marble. My parents watched me closely. They saw my silence as submission. They truly believed that their relentless bullying had worked just like it always did when I was a teenager living under their roof. They thought they had finally worn me down and put me back in my place as the obedient scapegoat. I picked up the invoice, holding it between my fingers. I looked at the massive total at the bottom of the page, and then I looked up at my parents. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was the smile of a woman who had just been handed the exact weapon she needed to destroy her enemies permanently. I let the silence stretch for another 10 seconds. I allowed my shoulders to physically slump forward, perfectly mimicking the defeated posture of the broken teenage girl they used to control. I let out a long, trembling sigh and slowly slid the heavy cardstock invoice across the marble island toward my father. "Fine," I whispered, injecting just enough exhaustion into my voice to make it entirely believable. "You win, Dad. I will pay the $100,000 country club bill." Richard snatched the paper off the counter with a triumphant smirk. He folded it neatly and slipped it back into his tailored coat pocket. He looked at my mother, Susan, with a profound sense of vindication. They had walked into my sanctuary and successfully bullied me into submission. It was the exact dynamic they had relied on for my entire life, and they were thrilled to see it was still fully operational. And the job, my mother pressed her eyes, narrowing to make sure she was extracting every single ounce of my surrender. "You will hire him today. Bring Bradley to my office tomorrow at noon," I said, keeping my voice flat and completely devoid of emotion. "Northwestern Memorial Hospital, the surgical administrative wing on the top floor. Do not be late. I will have a contract drafted and ready for him to sign. Once he signs the paperwork, I will issue him a corporate hospital badge and put him on the official payroll." You can take a picture of his office door and send it to Judge Davis to prove he is employed. Susan let out a deep breath of relief, her tense shoulders finally relaxing. She reached out and patted the marble countertop, acting as if she had just successfully negotiated a massive corporate merger. "I knew you would eventually see reason, Claire," she said, her voice returning to its usual condescending tone. "You are finally acting like a part of this family. We will see you tomorrow at noon. Make sure you clear your schedule so you can give him a proper tour of the facility." Richard did not bother to say thank you. He just gave me a stern warning look, pointing a thick finger in my direction. "Do not try any games tomorrow, Claire. Bradley has been through enough emotional trauma because of your little stunt last night. Have the paperwork ready." They turned around and walked back to the private elevator. The polished steel doors slid open, and they stepped inside. Susan gave me one final smug smile before the doors slid shut, completely sealing them inside. The numbers above the elevator panel began to rapidly tick down toward the lobby. The second the numbers hit the ground floor, my defeated posture completely vanished. I stood up perfectly straight and let out a sharp, genuinely amused laugh. My parents were so blinded by their own arrogance and their desperate need to maintain their social standing that they had just willingly walked right into a massive trap. They truly believed I was going to hand a fraudulent medical school dropout the keys to a multi-billion-dollar surgical center. I turned around and grabbed my phone from the kitchen counter. I did not call my bank to pay their ridiculous country club invoice. I opened my contacts and dialed the number Naomi had texted me from the valet parking lot last night. The phone rang exactly one time before the line clicked open. "Claire," Naomi said, her voice completely steady and wide awake. "I was wondering if you were going to call me today. I did not call to apologize for the scene at your engagement party." "Naomi?" I started walking over to the floor-to-ceiling windows to look out at the city. "I am calling because my parents just left my apartment. They broke into my building at 7 in the morning to demand that I pay for the entire party." "Let me guess." Naomi interrupted, her tone dry and completely devoid of any surprise. "They also demanded that you publicly retract your statements and find a way to validate Bradley's fake medical career so my father will not force me to cancel the wedding. They want me to hire him as an executive administrative director at my hospital," I confirmed, smiling at how quickly her brilliant legal mind worked. "They want me to give him a corner office, a massive salary, and a hospital badge by noon tomorrow. They think they have bullied me into agreeing. They are bringing him to my office to sign an employment contract." There was a brief moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then Naomi let out a low, dark laugh that sent a chill down my spine. It was the laugh of a predator who had just spotted its prey walking blindly into an open field. "Are you familiar with the legal concept of a trap contract?" Dr. Claire, Naomi asked, the sound of rapid typing clacking away on a keyboard in the background. "I am a trauma surgeon," Naomi, I replied. "I cut people open and put them back together. I do not write legal documents. But I have a very strong feeling you are about to give me a crash course. I am sitting in my home office right now," Naomi explained, her voice shifting into pure professional mode. "I have not slept since we left the country club last night. The man I was supposed to marry in 6 weeks turned out to be a complete phantom. He does not exist. The charming, successful doctor was a character he created using your exact medical credentials, so I decided to do what I do best. I treated my own fiancé like a hostile corporate entity, and I launched a full-scale independent investigation into his background." I leaned against the glass window, listening intently. "What did you find?" "Your parents think the worst thing Bradley did was lie about graduating from medical school," Naomi said, her voice dropping into a very serious and dangerous register. "They think this is just a family dispute about a fake job title. They have absolutely no idea what their golden boy has actually been doing with his free time and their money." Naomi paused, taking a deep breath before dropping the absolute massive bombshell. "I pulled his financial records." "Claire," Naomi continued, I ran a deep background check using his social security number and the national provider identifier number he stole from your medical license. The $250,000 your parents gave him for tuition is entirely gone. He blew it on luxury cars, designer clothes, and VIP club tables to trick me into thinking he was rich. But when their money ran out, he did not stop spending. What did he do? I asked, my grip tightening around my phone. He used your medical license number to secure fraudulent personal loans from 3 different private banks. Naomi revealed, the anger finally bleeding into her calm corporate voice. He convinced them he was a high-earning surgeon opening a private practice. But that is not even the worst part. 3 months ago, Bradley convinced my uncle to invest $75,000 into a fake medical startup company. He routed the money through a shell corporation registered in Delaware. My stomach dropped as the sheer scale of my brother's criminality finally became clear. He did not just steal my identity, he stole actual money from her powerful family. Claire, Naomi said, her voice razor sharp. Bradley crossed the line from being a pathetic liar to committing multiple counts of federal wire fraud and grand larceny. If he signs any document tomorrow claiming he is a medical professional or a hospital administrator in your building, it is the final nail in his coffin. I am going to draft a very specific legal document for you to hand him tomorrow at noon. We are not just going to embarrass him. We are going to send him to federal prison. I ended the call with Naomi and set my phone down on the cold marble counter of my kitchen. The sheer magnitude of my brother's crimes hung heavily in the quiet air of my penthouse. He was no longer just a pathetic liar trying to impress a wealthy woman. He was a federal criminal who had crossed lines that could not be uncrossed. I felt a deep, cold resolve settle into my bones. I packed my briefcase and headed to the hospital for my afternoon shift, completely prepared to face whatever my family threw at me next. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, I was sitting at the massive mahogany desk in my private office, reviewing patient files, when my phone began to vibrate. It did not just buzz once or twice. It lit up continuously, sliding across the polished wood of my desk like a switchboard experiencing a massive system failure. My mother, Susan, had clearly spent her morning making phone calls and spinning her elaborate web of lies to our extended family. She had officially activated her flying monkeys. I watched 5 missed calls from my Aunt Brenda pile up on my screen in rapid succession. Brenda was my mother's older sister and the loudest, most vicious gossip in our entire family tree. She was the kind of woman who weaponized family loyalty to control everyone around her. I tapped the screen to listen to the first voicemail. Brenda's voice blasted through the speaker of my phone, dripping with absolute venom and righteous indignation. "Claire, I just got off the phone with your mother, and I am absolutely disgusted with you," Brenda shouted into the receiver. "She is weeping inconsolably in her kitchen right now. How dare you subject your own parents to that kind of emotional elder abuse? They gave up everything to raise you, and this is how you repay them. You march into that engagement party uninvited and start screaming like a lunatic. You are 35 years old and acting like a jealous toddler. You need to call your mother and beg for her forgiveness right this second." The first voicemail ended with a sharp click, but the next one immediately began playing. Brenda had not finished her tirade. "You have always been completely unlovable, Claire." Brenda continued, her voice growing even louder and more grating. "That is exactly why you are sitting all alone in that apartment while Bradley is out building a beautiful, successful life. You cannot stand the fact that he found a brilliant woman like Naomi, so you had to invent these psychotic lies to destroy his happiness. You are a bitter, miserable spinster. Do not even think about showing up to Thanksgiving dinner this year. You are dead to this family until you fix what you broke." I deleted the voicemails and opened my social media applications. The coordinated smear campaign was already in full swing. My cousins, who had not spoken to me in over 5 years, were suddenly posting vague, passive-aggressive text graphics on their pages. They were acting as the loyal soldiers in my mother's army of misinformation. I scrolled through statuses that said things like, Blood does not make you family, and protect your peace from toxic relatives who want to ruin your biggest blessings. Another older cousin posted a long dramatic paragraph about how miserable people will try to blow out your candle just to make their own shine brighter. It was a perfectly orchestrated character assassination. Susan had painted herself and Bradley as the innocent victims of my unhinged jealousy, and the entire extended family was eagerly eating out of the palm of her hand. They were circling the wagons to protect the golden child, completely oblivious to the fact that they were defending a man who had stolen $75,000 from his fiancée family. Years ago, this kind of coordinated family attack would have sent me into a terrifying spiral of anxiety. I would have spent hours drafting desperate apology texts, trying to explain my side of the story and begging for their understanding. I would have questioned my own sanity. But today, sitting in my corner office as the chief of surgery, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I was observing them like a scientist watching a predictable experiment play out. I did not respond to a single comment. I did not defend myself online. Instead, I calmly took high-resolution screenshots of every single post, every nasty comment, and every threatening message. I forwarded the audio files of Brenda's vicious voicemails directly to Naomi so she could add them to her growing legal arsenal. My family was completely unaware that they were just providing us with perfectly documented evidence of their ongoing harassment. I locked my phone and turned back to my computer screen to finish my surgical notes. I had a department meeting in 20 minutes, and I refused to let their childish drama interrupt my actual professional responsibilities. But just as I reached for my mouse, a bright banner notification suddenly dropped down from the top of my phone screen. It was a direct text message from Bradley. I picked up the device and read his words. He was completely oblivious to the federal trap Naomi and I were currently setting for him. He actually believed that my parents had successfully intimidated me into submission during their morning raid on my apartment. His breathtaking audacity was almost impressive. His text read, "Mom said you finally caved and agreed to the hospital job. I expect the employment paperwork to be fully drafted by the time I walk into your office tomorrow at noon. Make sure my starting salary is at least $200,000 to compensate for the severe emotional distress you caused me last night. Also, I expect a luxury company car to be included in my executive benefits package. I prefer a Range Rover, but I will settle for a Mercedes-Benz as long as it is black and fully loaded. Make sure my reserved parking spot is right near the front entrance, so I do not have to walk far. Do not mess this up, Claire. See you tomorrow, sis." I stared at the text message from my brother for a long time. The sheer breathtaking entitlement radiating from my glowing phone screen was almost difficult to process. Bradley was not just asking for a fake job to save his engagement. He was demanding a $200,000 salary and a fully loaded luxury vehicle as compensation for the emotional distress I had supposedly caused him. He genuinely believed he had won. He thought my parents had successfully terrorized me into submission, and now he was ready to reap the rewards of his own fraud. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I only felt the cold clinical satisfaction of a surgeon who has just located the exact source of an infection and is preparing to cut it out permanently. I did not reply to his message. Instead, I pressed the buttons on my phone and took a clear, high-resolution screenshot of his entire list of demands. I made sure his name and phone number were perfectly visible at the top of the image. Then I opened my secure cloud storage and retrieved two specific files. The first was a scanned color copy of my official medical diploma from Johns Hopkins University, clearly stating my graduation honors. The second was a photograph of my active state surgical license. Finally, I opened my web browser and copied the direct link to the National Public Medical Registry. It is a government database where anyone can search for a licensed medical professional. If you type my name into that database, my credentials pop up immediately. If you type Bradley's name, it yields absolutely zero results. I gathered all of this digital ammunition and opened the massive extended family group chat. It was the exact same chat where my aunts, uncles, and cousins had been passively-aggressively attacking me all morning. There were 42 family members in this single text thread. Up until this very second, they had been happily feasting on my mother's fabricated narrative, painting me as the jealous, unstable spinster trying to ruin my brother's beautiful life. It was time to serve them the actual main course. I uploaded the screenshot of Bradley's absurd demands for a luxury car and a fake hospital job. I uploaded the photo of my medical degree and my state surgical license. I pasted the link to the National Medical Registry right below the images. Then I typed a single, devastating sentence. Feel free to ask Bradley where his $250,000 tuition went. I pressed send. The images and the text delivered instantly to 42 different phones across the country. I leaned back in my heavy leather office chair and watched the screen. For the first 30 seconds, there was absolutely nothing. Complete dead silence. I could almost picture my aunts and cousins opening the chat expecting another passive-aggressive quote about family loyalty, only to be hit directly in the face with undeniable legal and digital proof of a massive scam. Then the little read receipts began to pop up one by one. The tiny profile pictures of my extended family members appeared at the bottom of the screen, indicating they had seen the message. Suddenly, the chat erupted. The typing indicator bubbles began flashing wildly as multiple people tried to respond at the exact same time. My cousin David was the first to reply. His message simply read, "Wait, is this real? Is Bradley not a doctor?" Before anyone could answer, David, another cousin, chimed in, stating that she had just clicked the registry link and searched Bradley's name. She announced to the entire family that he was completely unlisted. Then my Uncle George, the family accountant, sent a message pointing out the screenshot of Bradley's demands. George noted that asking for a fake hospital job to appease a wealthy fiancé was textbook fraud. The carefully constructed narrative my mother had spent all morning building completely collapsed in less than 2 minutes. The group chat descended into absolute digital chaos. The family members who had been posting nasty quotes about me just an hour ago were now ruthlessly interrogating my parents. They wanted to know why they had been lied to. They wanted to know why Susan had spent the entire morning crying on the phone about my supposed mental breakdown, when the truth was that her golden boy was a con artist. And then came Aunt Brenda, the same woman who had left me blistering voicemails accusing me of elder abuse and calling me a miserable, unlovable spinster, suddenly realized she had backed the wrong horse. Brenda was a vicious gossip, but she hated looking foolish more than anything else in the world. Brenda sent a direct text message to my personal number, completely bypassing the group chat. "Claire, honey," her message read, "I had absolutely no idea. Your mother told me you were off your medication and hallucinating. You know how dramatic Susan can be. Please forgive me for those voicemails. I was just acting out of concern for the family. We are all so proud of your medical degree." I stared at her pathetic attempt to backpedal. I did not text her back. I blocked her number entirely. I was done allowing these toxic people to flip-flop between abusing me and praising me depending on who held the power. Just as I set my phone down on my desk, it began to vibrate violently. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. Susan was calling. I let it ring 3 times, enjoying the image of her panicking in her pristine suburban kitchen as her extended family demanded answers she could not provide. On the 4th ring, I picked up the phone and pressed it to my ear. I did not even say hello. "Claire, what the hell did you just do?" Susan screamed at the absolute top of her lungs. Her voice was completely hysterical, cracking with pure panic. "My phone has not stopped ringing for 10 minutes. Brenda is screaming at me. George is demanding to see Bradley's financial records. You dropped a nuclear bomb on our entire family." I simply shared a few updates with the relatives. "Mother," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "I thought everyone should be fully informed before Bradley starts his big new job at my hospital tomorrow." "You are destroying this family," Susan sobbed, her breathing jagged and erratic. "You are tearing us apart over a petty grudge. We are going to be the laughingstock of the entire city. No one will ever speak to us again. You malicious, ungrateful little snake." She was completely unhinged. The social standing she valued above everything else was currently burning to the ground, and she was trapped inside the fire. But instead of apologizing or showing any remorse for her own actions, she reverted to the ultimate narcissistic threat. "If you do not call George and Brenda right now and tell them this was a prank, I will legally disown you." Susan threatened, her voice dropping into a vicious growl. "I will have our lawyers draw up the paperwork today. We will strip you of our family name. You will get absolutely nothing when we die. You will be completely cut off from this family forever." I listened to her desperate, pathetic threat. She was threatening to take away a family I had not felt a part of in over 20 years. She was threatening to withhold an inheritance that I already knew was completely gone because they had blown it all on my worthless brother. "You cannot fire me from a family I already quit, Susan," I said, my tone dropping to a chilling whisper. "I do not want your name, and I certainly do not want your debts. Make sure Bradley is at my office at noon tomorrow. If he is late, I pull the job offer entirely." Before she could scream another word, I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the end call button. I tossed the phone onto my mahogany desk and let out a long, deep breath. The flying monkeys were scattered. My parents were completely backed into a corner of their own making. The stage was perfectly set. Tomorrow at noon, the golden boy was going to walk right into a federal trap, and I was going to gladly hold the door open for him. The next morning arrived with the crisp, cool air that usually signaled a shift in the Chicago weather. I woke up at 5 in the morning completely refreshed and entirely unbothered by the absolute chaos I had unleashed upon my extended family the previous afternoon. I went through my normal morning routine. I drank my espresso, went for a run along the lakefront, and drove my car to Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Walking through the sliding glass doors of the main surgical wing, I felt the familiar comforting weight of my actual reality. Doctors, nurses, and administrative staff greeted me with genuine respect as I made my way to the private elevator. I was not the terrified scapegoat daughter here. I was the chief of general surgery. I held lives in my hands every single day, and I ran one of the most prestigious and high-pressure departments in the entire state. I walked into my massive corner office and shut the heavy oak door behind me. My office was a testament to the decades of grueling work I had put into my career. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning panoramic view of the city skyline. My degrees and board certifications were framed perfectly on the wall directly behind my mahogany desk. I set my briefcase down, took off my coat, and sat in my leather chair. It was 8 in the morning. I had exactly 4 hours until my parents and my golden child brother arrived to claim the executive job they believed they had successfully extorted from me. I opened my laptop and logged into my secure hospital email portal to check my messages before my morning rounds. Right at the top of my inbox was an email from an external address. The sender name was simply Dr. Bradley. He was still using the fake title even in his private email accounts. The subject line read, "Executive Employment Requirements and Signing Bonus." I leaned back in my chair and clicked on the email. I expected Bradley to be arrogant, but the sheer breathtaking magnitude of his delusion actually made me laugh out loud in the quiet of my office. He had not just sent a brief message confirming our noon appointment. He had spent his evening drafting a highly detailed itemized list of his mandatory requirements for accepting the administrative position at my hospital. He wrote the email with the tone of a highly sought-after corporate executive doing me a massive favor by agreeing to work in my building. Claire, the email began skipping any formal greeting. "Since Mom and Dad forced you to finally do the right thing and offer me this executive director position, I have compiled a list of my requirements. I expect all of this to be fully included in the employment contract I am signing at noon today. First, I require a corner office on the same floor as yours with an unobstructed view of the lake. I want the hospital to completely refurnish it before I move in. Second, I require a dedicated personal assistant. She must be a woman under 30, and she must be available to manage my personal schedule as well as my hospital duties." I shook my head, reading the horrific misogyny baked right into his professional demands, but the email only grew more absurd as I scrolled down. Third Bradley continued. I expect a dedicated parking space in the underground garage right next to the private elevator. And finally, to compensate for the severe emotional distress and public humiliation you caused me and my fiancé at our engagement party, I require a mandatory signing bonus of $200,000 to be wired directly into my personal checking account by the end of the business day. If these basic requirements are not met, I will walk away from this offer, and you will have to explain to Mom and Dad why you failed the family again. See you at noon. He was trying to strong-arm a chief of surgery into handing him $200,000 of hospital funding while actively impersonating a doctor. It was not just arrogant, it was highly documented extortion. I did not reply to his email. I did not tell him he was out of his mind. I simply moved my mouse and clicked the print button. The laser printer in the corner of my office hummed quietly and spit out a crisp, warm sheet of paper containing every single one of his fraudulent demands. I picked up the printed email and walked back over to my mahogany desk. Resting exactly in the center of my desk was a thick, heavy legal folder made of dark blue cardstock. It had been hand-delivered to my office an hour earlier by a private courier dispatched directly from Naomi's corporate law firm. Naomi had stayed awake the entire night, utilizing her immense legal resources and her brilliant mind to compile a comprehensive dossier of my brother's federal crimes. I opened the heavy blue folder and reviewed the contents one last time to ensure everything was perfectly in place. The trap was a masterpiece of legal execution. The first document was not an employment contract. It was a legally binding cease and desist order demanding that Bradley immediately stop impersonating a medical professional and stop utilizing my state medical license number for personal gain. It detailed the exact statutes he had violated, but that was only the cover page. Beneath the cease and desist were 50 pages of highly incriminating financial documents. Naomi had pulled the bank statements showing exactly where my parents' $250,000 tuition money had gone. There were receipts for luxury car leases, VIP bottle service at downtown nightclubs, and expensive jewelry. Beneath those were the loan applications where Bradley had forged my medical credentials to secure private bank funding. And at the very bottom of the stack was the police report Naomi had filed that morning, officially charging him with grand larceny for stealing $75,000 from her uncle's investment firm. I placed Bradley's printed list of absurd demands right next to Naomi's thick folder of federal evidence. The contrast between his manufactured delusion and the crushing weight of reality was perfectly laid out on my desk. He wanted a luxury company car and a corner office. What he was actually going to get was a pair of handcuffs and a mandatory court date. I spent the next 3 hours conducting my morning surgical rounds entirely unfazed by the impending family confrontation. I checked on my post-operative patients, consulted with the attending nurses, and reviewed surgical schedules for the upcoming week. My mind was completely focused on my actual job. By the time I returned to my office, it was 11:45. I washed my hands, adjusted my white coat, and sat down behind my desk. I placed my hands flat on the polished mahogany and waited. The digital clock on my computer screen ticked perfectly to 12 noon. Exactly on time, the intercom on my desk buzzed loudly. It was Joanne, my executive administrative assistant. Joanne had been working at the hospital for 20 years. She was a tough, no-nonsense woman who ran the surgical floor reception area with absolute authority. Dr. Claire Joanne said, her voice dripping with an icy professional disdain that she rarely used. "Yes, Joanne," I answered, pressing the intercom button. "Your family is here," Joanne reported. She did not bother to hide her deep annoyance. "They bypassed the security desk downstairs by claiming they had a private executive appointment with you. And they are currently standing in our reception area, shouting at the nursing staff." "What seems to be the problem?" I asked, maintaining a perfectly neutral tone. "The man who claims to be your brother is furious that we do not have a private waiting room prepared for him," Joanne explained, the irritation vibrating through the speaker. And your mother just snapped her fingers at one of my senior triage nurses and demanded that she drop her patient charts to go fetch them 3 iced lattes from the cafeteria downstairs. The young man is also currently demanding to know where his new office is located. I smiled a cold, satisfied smile. They were treating my highly trained medical staff like personal servants. They were walking around my surgical ward acting like they owned the entire building, simply because they shared my last name. Their arrogance had completely blinded them to the environment they had just walked into. "Do not get them any coffee, Joanne," I instructed, my voice calm and commanding. "And please apologize to the nursing staff on my behalf. You can send them back to my office now." "And Joanne?" "Yes, Dr. Claire," she replied. "After they walk into my office, I need you to make a quick phone call to the hospital security director," I said, looking down at the heavy blue legal folder resting on my desk. "Tell him I need 2 armed security officers stationed quietly in the hallway right outside my door in exactly 10 minutes. "Understood," Dr. Joanne replied, her tone instantly shifting from annoyed to completely serious. "Sending them back now." The intercom clicked off. The trap was set, the doors were locked, and the golden child was about to walk blindly right into his own execution. I did not unlock my office door right away. Even though Joanne had buzzed to let me know they were standing in the reception area, I specifically instructed her to hold them in the secondary waiting room down the hall. I made them sit there for exactly 45 minutes. In the highly competitive corporate and medical world, making someone wait is the ultimate silent assertion of power. I wanted them to sit in those stiff, uncomfortable chairs and watch my surgical staff rush around saving actual lives. I wanted them to absorb the intense, high-stakes atmosphere of my daily reality. I wanted them to feel entirely out of their element before they even stepped foot into my space. At exactly 12:45, my heavy oak office door violently swung open without a single knock. Richard walked in first, leading the charge like an angry general invading a foreign country. Susan followed closely behind him, clutching her designer handbag against her chest like a protective shield. Bradley strolled in last, trying desperately to project the casual, careless confidence of a man who belonged in an executive suite. But I saw the way their eyes immediately darted around the massive room. I saw my father's gaze sweep over the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the vast expanse of Lake Michigan and the impressive gallery of framed medical board certifications covering my wall. They were standing in the physical manifestation of my undeniable success. For 35 years, they had desperately tried to convince themselves and everyone else that I was a failure. Seeing the absolute magnitude of my professional empire terrified them because it shattered their entire fabricated reality. To mask that deep-seated terror, they instantly defaulted to the only defense mechanism they knew how to use: pure, blistering arrogance. Susan let out a dramatic, exaggerated huff and completely ignored me, marching straight over to the white leather guest sofa in the corner of the office. She collapsed onto the cushions and let out a long, suffering sigh. "The parking situation at this hospital is an absolute nightmare, Claire," my mother complained, rubbing her temples as if she had just endured a grueling physical marathon. "We had to park 3 levels down in the damp executive garage because your rude assistant refused to clear the VIP ambulance bay for our vehicle. You need to have a very serious talk with your staff about how they treat your family members. I expect a designated parking space with my name painted on it if I am going to be visiting Bradley here regularly." Richard completely ignored the guest chairs. He marched right up to my mahogany desk, his face flushed red with irritation. He aggressively tapped the face of his heavy gold watch. "You are 45 minutes late." Richard snapped, his voice booming in the quiet acoustics of the office. "We have a 1:30 reservation at Gibson's Steakhouse to celebrate Bradley's new position. I will not lose our table and pay a cancellation fee because you do not know how to properly manage your daily schedule. Stop playing these ridiculous, childish power games and let us get this over with. Hand him the employment contract right now so we can leave." I did not respond to my father. I shifted my gaze to Bradley. My brother smirked. He walked around my furious father, and threw himself heavily into one of the expensive leather guest chairs directly across from my desk. He did not say a word at first. He just looked at me with a smug, victorious grin, completely convinced that he had utterly defeated me. He reached out, grabbed the edge of my pristine mahogany desk, and swung his legs up, placing his expensive leather shoes squarely on top of the polished wood. He crossed his ankles and laced his fingers behind his head, leaning back like a king surveying his newly conquered castle. "Nice setup, sis," Bradley finally said, looking around the room with greedy, calculating eyes. "I think I am going to like working here. Did you get my email this morning about my office requirements? I noticed there is an empty corner suite right down the hall near the elevators. I want the hospital maintenance team to start moving my new furniture in by tomorrow morning." Bradley let out a short, arrogant laugh and kicked his heels lightly against my desk, leaving a faint scuff mark on the wood. "And I hope you did not skimp on that signing bonus we discussed. Naomi has been completely ignoring my phone calls all morning. Her father, Judge Davis, is breathing down my neck, so I need to text her a picture of the hospital direct deposit immediately to get him off my back and get the wedding back on track." I looked at the scuff marks his shoes were leaving on my property. I looked at my father's red, impatient face demanding I hand over my hospital resources to fund their lies. I looked at my mother checking her lipstick in her compact mirror, completely oblivious to the severity of the crimes her son had committed. They thought they had successfully backed me into a corner. They truly believed that my silence over the last 45 minutes was the ultimate proof of my absolute surrender. They thought I was a terrified little girl who was just going to blindly obey their demands to keep the peace. I did not ask Bradley to take his feet off my desk. I did not apologize to my father for the wait, and I did not address my mother's ridiculous complaints about the emergency ambulance bay. I kept my face perfectly smooth and entirely expressionless. I slowly reached out and placed my hand flat on top of the sleek, heavy blue folder Naomi had couriered over that morning. Because of its premium dark blue cardstock and thick binding, the document looked exactly like a high-level corporate employment portfolio. I pushed it gently across the smooth mahogany surface. The folder slid perfectly, stopping right next to Bradley's expensive leather shoes. "Here is your paperwork, Bradley," I said, my voice dropping to a soft, chilling whisper that contrasted sharply with their loud, chaotic energy. Bradley let out a loud, triumphant laugh. He swung his legs off the desk and leaned forward, his eyes lighting up with absolute greed as he grabbed the heavy blue folder. He did not even bother to open it to read the first page. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a shiny gold pen. He clicked the pen with a sharp metallic snap, grinning from ear to ear, like a man who had just won the absolute lottery. Bradley flipped the heavy blue folder open. He did not even bother to read the first page or scan the dense legal paragraphs that outlined his massive financial liabilities. His unearned confidence blinded him completely. He flipped the thick stack of papers straight to the very last page, searching only for the signature line. He believed this was simply a formality, a piece of paper that would instantly grant him a corner office, a massive salary, and a luxury vehicle. He leaned forward, pressing his expensive gold pen against the thick cardstock. He signed his name with a dramatic, flourishing signature, adding the letters M and D at the end of his name just to twist the knife. He was actively committing fraud on the very document designed to destroy him. "There," he said, tossing the pen onto my mahogany desk with a loud clatter. "I am officially an executive director of this hospital. You can tell your little assistant outside to start setting up my corporate email account. And do not forget to wire that $200,000 signing bonus before the banks close at 5. He closed the heavy blue folder and pushed it back across the desk toward me. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms behind his head, completely satisfied with his perceived victory. My parents let out simultaneous sighs of relief. Susan adjusted her designer handbag, and Richard checked his heavy gold watch, eager to make their steakhouse reservation. They had successfully bullied me into submission one last time. Or so they thought. I did not touch the folder. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I looked at my brother, a cold, tight smile spreading across my face. I reached out with my right hand and pressed the silver speakerphone button on my office telephone. A sharp, authoritative voice instantly rang out through the quiet acoustics of my corner office. "Thank you for signing the acknowledgement of receipt, Bradley." It was Naomi. The sound of her voice echoing from the speakerphone was like a physical shockwave hitting the room. Bradley's smug grin vanished instantly. He froze, his hands still laced behind his head, completely paralyzed by the sound of the woman he had spent the last 2 years deceiving. My mother Susan let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. Richard stopped checking his watch, his face instantly draining of color. Bradley slowly lowered his arms, staring at the telephone on my desk, as if it were an explosive device that had just been triggered. "Naomi, what are you doing on the phone?" he stammered, his voice cracking with sudden intense panic. "I am conducting official legal business." "Bradley." Naomi answered, her voice dripping with absolute icy professionalism. She sounded exactly like a corporate litigator destroying a hostile witness on the stand. "I asked Claire to keep me on the line so I could personally verify that you received and signed the documents my firm prepared for you." "Documents?" Bradley repeated, his eyes darting frantically from the phone to the heavy blue folder resting on my desk. "What documents?" "What?" "That was my employment contract." I leaned forward. I placed my hand on the heavy blue folder and slowly flipped it back open to the very first page. I turned the entire document around so it was facing my brother directly. "Read the bold header at the top of the page, Bradley," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying register. "Read exactly what you just signed." Bradley leaned forward, his eyes scanning the top of the thick legal document. He began to read aloud, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "Notice of formal cease and desist, and notification of pending criminal charges for multiple counts of felony fraud." He dropped back into his leather chair as if he had been physically struck. The gold pen he had used to sign the document rolled off the edge of my desk and clattered onto the hardwood floor. "That is not a job offer, Bradley," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "That is a legally binding acknowledgement that you have been served with formal notice of your crimes. By signing that last page, you officially confirmed receipt of the evidence we have gathered against you." "This is a trick," Susan screamed, suddenly jumping up from the white leather sofa. She rushed over to my desk, her expensive heels clicking loudly against the floor. "You cannot do this, Claire. He is your brother. You are playing some kind of sick, twisted joke." "This is not a joke," Naomi's voice boomed from the speakerphone, cutting through my mother's hysterical shouting. "I have spent the last 12 hours utilizing every single resource at my disposal to investigate the man I was supposed to marry. And what I found was not a successful surgeon. I found a serial con artist who has been actively committing federal wire fraud." Richard lunged forward, slamming both of his heavy hands down onto my desk. "You watch your mouth, Naomi!" Richard bellowed, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of purple. "My son is a highly respected professional. We paid for his medical degree. We have the bank statements to prove we sent him to a Caribbean medical school. You cannot just invent criminal charges because you are upset about a ruined party." "Oh, I assure you," Naomi replied, her tone completely unfazed by his aggressive outburst. "I am not inventing anything. I have the receipts. Turn to page 12 of that folder, Bradley. Tell your father exactly what you did with his $250,000. Bradley did not move. He was completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the legal document that had just destroyed his entire life. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his tailored suit jacket. "Turn to page 12. Bradley," I ordered, pointing sharply at the folder. With shaking hands, Bradley slowly turned the thick pages until he reached the financial section of the dossier. He stared at the densely packed bank statements and credit card bills. His face was completely pale, the blood draining entirely from his cheeks. "What does it say?" Richard demanded, snatching the folder out of Bradley's hands. My father aggressively flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the highlighted sections Naomi had carefully prepared. Richard's aggressive demeanor completely evaporated in less than 3 seconds. The furious purple flush of his face was instantly replaced by a sickening grayish pallor. He stared at the paper, his mouth opening and closing in absolute silent horror. The truth that he had spent decades denying was finally printed right in front of his face in undeniable black and white ink. The Caribbean medical school tuition was $25,000. Richard whispered, his voice cracking. He looked up at Bradley, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and rising fury. The rest of the money, the $225,000. It went to luxury car leases. It went to VIP bottle service in Miami. It went to designer clothes and a high-end apartment. Richard dropped the folder back onto the desk, his hands shaking violently. You failed out in your second year. He breathed out, the realization finally hitting him with the force of a freight train. You have been living off our money, pretending to study for board exams you never even took. You lied to us for 4 years. Susan let out a loud, dramatic wail, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. No, she sobbed, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face. No, my sweet boy would never do that. This is a mistake. Claire manufactured these documents to frame him. I did not manufacture anything, Susan Naomi stated firmly from the speakerphone. Those are official bank records subpoenaed by my firm this morning, but blowing your money on luxury cars is actually the least of his problems. Turn to page 25. I reached across the desk and flipped the heavy stack of papers to the specific page Naomi requested. It was a copy of a massive bank loan application from a prominent private financial institution. Look at the signature line on that loan application, Richard first instructed. Look at the credentials he used to secure that funding. Richard leaned over the desk, his eyes scanning the document. He secured a massive personal loan by claiming he was a board-certified surgeon. Richard read aloud, his voice hollow and completely defeated. He used a state medical license number. He used my state medical license number. I corrected him, my voice sharp as a scalpel. He committed identity theft and federal wire fraud to secure bank funding he had absolutely no intention of repaying. Bradley suddenly lunged forward, grabbing the edge of my mahogany desk. He looked at the speakerphone with wild, desperate eyes. Naomi, please, he begged, his voice cracking with sheer panic. I only did it so I could be the man you deserved. I wanted to build a life for us. I can pay the bank back. My parents will remortgage their house again. We can fix this quietly. A heavy, chilling silence descended over the office. My mother stopped crying. My father froze completely rigid, staring at Bradley as if he had just sprouted a second head. Remortgage the house again, Richard repeated, his voice dangerously low. He turned his head slowly to look at his weeping wife. Susan, what did he just say? What does he mean, remortgage the house again? Richard stood completely motionless, his eyes locked onto Susan. The word again hung in the air between them like a live grenade. Susan backed away from my desk, her hands fluttering wildly in front of her face as she began to hyperventilate. Short, ragged gasps tore through her throat. She shook her head so violently her perfectly styled blonde hair began to unravel and fall into her eyes. It is a lie! Susan shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the speakerphone. She is lying, Richard. Claire and this horrible, vindictive woman fabricated all of this to destroy him. Bradley would never take out a fraudulent loan. He does not even know Claire's license number. This is just another one of her psychotic delusions. I reached out and pressed the volume button on my office telephone, amplifying Naomi's voice so it completely drowned out my mother's hysterical screaming. I do not need to fabricate anything, Susan, Naomi stated smoothly, her voice echoing off the floor-to-ceiling windows. National provider identifier numbers are utilized by hospitals and insurance companies to track medical providers. It is essentially a social security number for a doctor's entire career. Committing basic financial fraud is one thing, but using a federal medical provider number crosses the line into a territory that involves the medical board and federal investigators. Your son memorized Claire's NPI from a piece of official hospital mail you forwarded to his apartment 3 years ago. He used it on a commercial business loan application at a private wealth bank, claiming he was a chief of surgery opening a boutique medical clinic in downtown Chicago. I leaned forward and tapped the specific page resting directly in front of my father. "Read the requested loan amount, Dad," I instructed softly. Richard looked down at the paper. His chest was rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. He swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the highlighted numbers. $500,000, he whispered, his voice entirely hollow and stripped of all its previous arrogance. "Yes," I confirmed, keeping my tone perfectly clinical. $500,000. He forged my signature and used my pristine medical credit history to secure the funds. The bank approved it quickly because on paper, I am a highly successful trauma surgeon with zero debt. But the money did not go to a medical clinic. I reached into my bottom desk drawer and pulled out the second half of the massive stack of bank statements Naomi had legally subpoenaed. These were the documents that completely dismantled the final illusion of the golden boy. I tossed the thick stack onto the mahogany desk. They landed with a heavy thud sliding across the polished wood until they hit Bradley's discarded gold pen. I spread the papers out like a deck of cards, revealing hundreds of pages of highlighted transactions. There were charges for $2,000 dinners at Michelin star restaurants. There were $15,000 wire transfers to luxury car dealerships. There were massive payments to high-end jewelry stores. Bradley squeezed his eyes shut and buried his face in his hands. He did not try to deny it. He knew exactly what those papers contained. He just sat there quietly sobbing into his palms, his shoulders shaking under his expensive tailored suit. Naomi continued her relentless legal assault over the speakerphone. "The $250,000 you gave him for tuition ran out in his second year of pretending to be a medical student," Naomi explained. "When your money vanished, he secured the fraudulent $500,000 bank loan using Claire's identity. But Bradley has very expensive tastes. He spent that $500,000 in less than 18 months. He leased a luxury penthouse apartment. He bought expensive watches to impress my father. He took me on lavish vacations to the Amalfi Coast, claiming his surgical practice was booming." Susan was gasping for air, her chest heaving heavily as she gripped the back of the white leather sofa to keep from physically collapsing onto the floor. She looked at Bradley, begging him silently to defend himself, but he refused to look up. But even $500,000 was not enough to sustain his fake billionaire lifestyle. Naomi's voice continued relentlessly. 7 months ago, the bank caught on to the discrepancies in his commercial loan repayments. They froze his remaining funds and threatened to contact the authorities. Bradley panicked. He needed a massive influx of cash immediately to prevent the bank from investigating the NPI number and discovering he was not actually Dr. Claire. Richard slowly raised his head. He looked like a man who had just been told he had a terminal illness. The imposing wealthy country club patriarch who had marched into my office 45 minutes ago demanding a job for his son was entirely gone. In his place stood a broken, aging man whose entire reality was crumbling around him. The horrifying puzzle pieces were finally snapping together in his mind. The timeline Naomi was laying out matched up perfectly with a period of intense financial stress in his own household. 7 months ago, Richard said, his voice trembling with a terrifying quiet rage. 7 months ago, Susan, you told me you needed my signature on a stack of legal documents for a routine insurance update on the house. Susan let out a loud, piercing wail. She collapsed onto the white leather sofa, burying her face in the cushions as she sobbed uncontrollably. Naomi did not offer a single ounce of pity. She delivered the final crushing blow with the absolute detachment of a seasoned prosecutor. "Your wife did not hand you insurance documents," Richard, Naomi stated. "She handed you the paperwork for a massive second mortgage on your family estate. She forged the notary's signature, she expedited the approval process through a friend at your local bank branch, and she funneled the entire equity of your fully paid-off home directly into Bradley's checking account to save him from defaulting on a fraudulent commercial loan." Richard stood frozen, staring at the woman he had been married to for nearly 40 years. The mother of his children, The woman who had constantly berated me for not being successful enough had secretly bankrolled a massive federal crime and risked their entire financial future to protect a pathological liar. "You stole my house," Richard whispered, his eyes wide with absolute disbelief. He took a slow, staggering step toward the sofa. "You stole the house I worked my entire life to pay off, and you gave the money to this pathetic, worthless fraud. I did it to save him." Susan screamed, sitting up from the cushions, her face streaked with heavy black mascara and tears. The bank was going to call the police, Richard. They were going to arrest him for identity theft. I could not let my baby boy go to prison. I was going to pay the mortgage back slowly. I had a plan to fix everything. "You do not have an income, Susan." Richard roared, the last remnants of his sanity completely snapping. His voice shook the glass windows of my office. "How are you going to pay back a second mortgage?" Susan looked frantically around the room until her tear-filled eyes locked onto me. She pointed a shaking, manic finger directly at my face. "Claire was going to pay it back." Susan sobbed, her voice echoing with absolute desperate delusion. "She is rich. She makes millions of dollars at this hospital. I was going to ask her to help us pay it off. She owes us for raising her. It is her family duty to step up and handle this." The sheer breathtaking narcissism of her plan hung in the cold air of my office. She had stolen from her husband to cover up the fact that her son had stolen from her daughter, and her ultimate solution was to demand that the daughter pay for all of it. I sat perfectly still, watching the toxic family dynamic that had tortured me for 35 years completely cannibalize itself right in front of my eyes. Richard completely snapped. The carefully curated country club facade that he had spent his entire life maintaining shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He turned on my mother with a level of pure, unadulterated fury that I had never seen before. The veins in his neck bulged as he stepped toward her, completely ignoring the fact that they were standing in my professional workplace. "You forged my signature on a federal banking document, Susan," Richard roared, his voice echoing violently off the glass windows. "You legally tied my name to a massive financial fraud to protect a son who dropped out of medical school to go clubbing in Miami. You secretly mortgaged the home I paid for with 40 years of my own blood and sweat. And your brilliant master plan was to march into this hospital and demand that the daughter you have treated like absolute garbage pay it all back. Are you completely out of your mind?" Susan shrank back against the white leather sofa, her hands raised defensively in front of her face. She was sobbing so hard she was choking on her own breath. "He is your son, Richard!" she cried desperately, trying to justify the absolute destruction of their lives. "We had to protect him. If the bank found out he lied on the commercial loan application, they were going to send him to jail. I was just trying to buy us some time. Claire is a millionaire. She could write a single check today and clear the entire debt. It is the least she could do after everything we provided for her." I did not have to say a single word. My father looked at my mother with a profound, chilling disgust. "You provided her with nothing," Richard said, his voice dropping into a harsh, raspy whisper. "We gave her absolutely nothing, Susan. We gave every single dollar we had to him. And he took it all and burned our entire lives to the ground. We are completely bankrupt." The screaming match had reached a deafening crescendo. The toxic family dynamic was cannibalizing itself right in front of my desk, tearing apart decades of lies and misplaced loyalty. But before my mother could launch into another hysterical defense, the heavy oak door to my office suddenly swung wide open. The loud argument abruptly stopped. Richard and Susan whipped their heads around toward the doorway. Bradley, who had been sitting frozen in his leather chair, finally looked up, his eyes wide and bloodshot from crying. Naomi stepped into the room. She was no longer just a sharp voice echoing from the speakerphone on my desk. She was physically here, and she was a terrifying sight to behold. She was dressed in a pristine, tailored black suit, her posture perfectly straight, radiating the absolute authority of a senior corporate partner who was ready to completely dismantle her opposition. But she did not walk into my office alone. Naomi was flanked by two massive armed hospital security guards. The guards stepped into the room behind her, crossing their arms over their bulletproof vests and planting their feet firmly by the door, entirely blocking the only exit. The silence that fell over the office was absolute. The sheer physical presence of the armed guards communicated a reality that my parents could no longer scream their way out of. This was no longer a messy family dispute. This was law enforcement. Naomi walked past my terrified parents without giving them a single glance. Her high heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor until she reached the front of my mahogany desk. She reached into her sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, official-looking document bound in a heavy manila folder. The front of the document was stamped with the official seal of the Chicago Police Department. Naomi dropped the police report right on top of the financial bank statements. It landed with a heavy final thud. "Your impending bankruptcy is the absolute least of your problems, Richard," Naomi stated, her voice perfectly calm and incredibly dangerous. "Because lying on a commercial bank loan to fund a fake billionaire lifestyle is a white-collar crime. But what your son did to my family crosses the line into a massive federal felony." Bradley let out a pathetic whimpering sound. He stared at the police report on the desk, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. 3 months ago, Bradley approached my uncle. Naomi continued, turning to face my parents so they could hear every single devastating detail. "My uncle manages a private equity firm that specializes in medical investments. Bradley brought him the surgical journals that Claire wrote. He brought him fabricated financial projections for a new state-of-the-art trauma center. And he brought him a forged letter of intent claiming that he was partnering with Northwestern Memorial Hospital to open the facility." Susan covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a muffled gasp of horror. Richard simply stared at Naomi, his arms hanging limply at his sides. "My uncle was impressed," Naomi said, her eyes locking onto Bradley with pure disgust. "He believed he was investing in his future son-in-law's brilliant medical career. So he wired $75,000 to the bank account Bradley provided. But my firm tracked that wire transfer this morning. The money did not go to a medical startup. It went to a shell corporation registered in Delaware under Bradley's name. He instantly drained the account to pay off the massive credit card debts he accumulated while trying to impress me." Naomi tapped the police report on the desk with her index finger. "Defrauding an investor across state lines using a shell corporation and a stolen medical identity is federal wire fraud and grand larceny. My uncle officially pressed charges 2 hours ago. The police are downstairs in the hospital lobby right now coordinating with your security team, Dr. Claire." The words hit the room with the devastating impact of an earthquake. Federal wire fraud, grand larceny, police in the lobby. The delusional fantasy world my parents had spent 35 years building around their golden child completely collapsed into dust. There was no amount of money they could borrow, and no lie they could invent to save him from this. Bradley finally realized that he had reached the absolute end of the road. The arrogant, demanding man who had walked into my office an hour ago, expecting a corner office and a luxury company car, completely shattered. He slid out of the expensive leather guest chair and fell heavily onto the hardwood floor. He landed directly on his knees. His tailored suit jacket wrinkled as his shoulders heaved with violent, uncontrollable sobs. He did not crawl toward Naomi to beg for her forgiveness, and he did not crawl toward his mother to ask for her protection. He knew exactly who held the actual power in the room. Bradley crawled across the floor until he was kneeling directly in front of my mahogany desk. He reached up and grabbed the edge of the wood, his knuckles white, his face completely covered in tears and panic. "Claire, please," he sobbed, his voice breaking into a high-pitched, pathetic wail. "Please, you have to stop them. You are the chief of surgery. You know the hospital security team. You can tell them to send the police away. Please tell Naomi you will pay her uncle back. You have millions of dollars, Claire. 75,000 is nothing to you. You can write a check right now and make all of this go away." I looked down at the man kneeling on the floor. For my entire life, I had been told that I was inferior to him. I had been forced to shrink myself to make room for his massive, unearned ego, and now he was kneeling at my feet, begging me to use the very wealth and power he had mocked me for building to save him from a prison sentence. Please, Claire Bradley begged again, his fingers frantically gripping the edge of my desk as if he were clinging to the edge of a cliff. We are brother and sister. Mom and Dad always said family takes care of family. You have to take care of me. Do not let them take me to jail. I will do anything. I will work for you. I will clean the hospital floors. Just please pay them the money. His desperate invocation of the family mantra was the ultimate insult. They only ever used the word family when they needed something from me. When I needed them to help me pay for college, I was told to go find a husband. When I needed their support at my medical school graduation, they were in Miami buying him a condo. They weaponized the concept of family to drain me dry, but the second they faced the consequences of their own actions, they expected me to be their savior. I sat perfectly still in my heavy leather chair. I looked at Bradley sobbing on his knees. I looked at my father staring blankly at the wall, completely broken by the realization of his bankruptcy. And I looked at my mother weeping on the sofa, mourning the death of her social status. They had finally trapped themselves in a cage made entirely of their own arrogance and greed. I looked down at the pathetic man kneeling on the hardwood floor of my office. His expensive tailored suit was wrinkled, and his face was slick with tears and panic. He was begging me to open my checkbook and erase the consequences of his federal crimes. He was expecting the sister he had mocked and belittled his entire life to instantly become his financial savior. I placed my hands flat on my mahogany desk and slowly stood up. I did not reach for my checkbook. I did not offer a single word of comfort. You are right, Bradley, I said, my voice perfectly steady in the quiet room. Family does take care of family. But you see, I do not have a family in this room. I am looking at a man who stole my medical identity to commit federal wire fraud. I am looking at a woman who secretly mortgaged her husband's hard-earned home to protect a criminal. And I am looking at a man who stood in front of 200 people last night and told them I was a worthless spinster. I shifted my gaze from Bradley to my father. Richard was still staring blankly at the wall, the terrifying reality of his absolute financial ruin completely paralyzing him. He had spent my entire childhood telling me I was a bad investment. You were right, Dad, I stated clearly, making sure the words echoed across the massive office. You told me years ago that girls do not need college. You told me I should just find a husband and let the men handle the important business. Well, you were right. Girls do not need college. But apparently your son needed a very good lawyer. Naomi did not even crack a smile. She simply turned her head and gave a sharp professional nod to the two armed hospital security guards standing by the door. The guards stepped forward into the room. They reached down and grabbed Bradley by the arms, hauling him up from his knees with effortless physical force. Bradley began to thrash wildly, his expensive leather shoes sliding across the hardwood floor. Mom, he screamed, his voice breaking into a terrified, childish wail. Mom, do not let them take me. Do something. Susan tried to lunge forward off the white leather sofa, but her legs completely gave out under her. She collapsed onto her hands and knees, sobbing hysterically on my office rug. She reached a shaking hand out toward her golden boy, but she was entirely powerless to stop what was happening. The guards dragged Bradley out of my office and marched him down the pristine hallway of the surgical wing. Through the open door, I could hear his panicked screams echoing down the corridor until the heavy steel doors of the private elevator slid shut, cutting off his voice entirely. The Chicago police officers were waiting for him in the main lobby downstairs with a pair of steel handcuffs. The illusion of Dr. Bradley was officially dead. I walked around my desk and stood over my weeping mother and my completely broken father. Get out of my hospital! I ordered, my voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. You are trespassing. If either of you ever try to contact me, step foot in this building, or show up at my apartment again, I will have you both arrested for criminal harassment. Richard slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes were hollow, completely devoid of the arrogant spark that had defined his entire existence. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to apologize, or to beg for a loan, but I held up a single hand, silencing him instantly. "There is nothing left to say, Richard," I told him firmly. "You made your investment. Now you have to live with the returns." My father slowly reached down and helped my mother up from the floor. Susan was trembling so violently she could barely stand on her designer heels. They did not look back at me. They shuffled out of my office like two ghosts, completely stripped of their wealth, their pride, and their favorite child. I watched them walk down the hallway until they disappeared around the corner. I reached out, grabbed the heavy oak door of my office, and firmly clicked it shut. 1 year has passed since that afternoon in my office. A lot can change in 12 months when the toxic deadweight is finally cut loose from your life. Bradley did not get away with his crimes. Naomi and her uncle ensured that the federal prosecutors had every single piece of evidence they needed. He pleaded guilty to multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. He was sentenced to 4 years in a federal correctional facility. There are no corner offices or luxury company cars where he is living now. My parents lost absolutely everything. When the bank discovered the fraud surrounding the commercial loan and the forged signatures on the second mortgage, they instantly initiated foreclosure proceedings. Richard and Susan were evicted from the sprawling suburban estate they had lived in for 3 decades. The country club immediately revoked their membership. Their wealthy friends entirely abandoned them the second the scandal hit the local news. They now live in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, completely estranged from the high society they valued more than their own daughter. I have not spoken a single word to them since the day they walked out of my office. But my life did not stop. In fact, it flourished in ways I never thought possible. It is a beautiful Sunday morning in Chicago, and the sun is shining brightly through the massive glass windows of my favorite downtown bistro. I am sitting at a prime corner table, but I am not alone. Naomi is sitting across from me, laughing brightly as the waiter pours us another round of fresh mimosas. Naomi did not just cancel her wedding. She completely leveled up her life. She was recently promoted to managing partner at her corporate law firm, and she has never looked happier or more radiant. Over the past year, she and I became incredibly close. We bonded over the shared trauma of surviving my family, but we stayed friends because we genuinely respect and admire each other. She became the sister I always deserved but never had. Naomi picked up her crystal glass and held it up into the air, her eyes sparkling with genuine joy. "I would like to propose a toast," she announced, a bright smile spreading across her beautiful face. "To the strongest, most brilliant woman I know, and to the newly appointed Chief of Medical Staff at Northwestern Memorial Hospital." I smiled, raising my glass to meet hers. The hospital board had officially promoted me last week. I had reached the absolute pinnacle of my career entirely on my own merit. "To peace," I replied softly, tapping my glass against hers. The crystal chimed with a clear, beautiful sound. I took a sip of my mimosa and looked out the window at the bustling city streets. For 35 years, I had let my family convince me that I was unworthy of love and success. They tried to bury me so their golden child could shine. But they forgot one crucial detail. I was the one who knew how to dig. I built my empire with my own 2 hands, and no one would ever be able to take it away from me again. Thank you for listening to my story. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your own peace and future? Let me know your experiences in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of surviving narcissistic families and reclaiming your absolute worth. Remember that your success is the greatest revenge you will ever need.